We can use Flowise API endpoints to integrate our chatbots into pretty much any type of application. And in this video, we will have a look at integrating a Flowise chat flow into a custom web application. This video is slightly more technical than the previous videos in this series, and a basic understanding of JavaScript will be beneficial. This project consists of two parts. The first part is the Flowise chat flow itself. For this demo, we will create a conversational agent that has access to the internet. We can use this chatbot to ask questions about recent events, or we can ask it to perform research for us. We will use the JavaScript API example in order to call this chat flow from our own Node application. And we will also secure this endpoint using an API key. In the second part of this tutorial, we will build a simple web application that will integrate our Flowise chat flow. Let's have a quick look at how this works. In the prompt field, we can ask our chat flow a question like, "What is Flowise?" After clicking send, our Node application will call the Flowise endpoint and it will write a response to the screen. As an added bonus, I will also show you how we can deploy our Node application to a production server on render. So let's get started. First, let's create our chat flow. For this demo, I will be using an instance of Flowise that was deployed to render. If you would like to learn how to deploy Flowise applications to render, then please check out my tutorial over here. Let's create our chat flow. First, let's click on Add New. Then let's save our chat flow and let's call it something like Research Chatbot. Let's add an agent to our project. So under Agents, select the conversational agent. Then for this agent, we need to assign a memory node, an LLM, as well as the tools that it should have access to. Let's first add the memory node. So under nodes, let's go to memory and let's select the buffer memory node. And let's connect our memory node to the agent. We can leave these values on the default values. Then let's add our model. So under chat models, let's select Chat OpenAI and let's connect the Chat OpenAI node to the agent. On the Chat OpenAI node, change the temperature to something like 0.4 and let's assign credentials to this node. So under credentials, click on this drop down, then click on create new. Let's give it a name like OpenAI API and let's then add our OpenAI API key and let's save this. Next, let's assign a tool which the agent can use to access the internet. Under nodes, go to tools and under tools, grab the SERP API node and add that to the canvas. Let's add this node to the allowed tools list. For credentials, click on the drop down and then click on create new. Let's give this credential a name. I'll just call it SERP API and let's then add our SERP API key like so. And let's click on add. There is one more change that I would like to make to this Chat OpenAI node. Let's click on additional parameters and let's change the max token size to 2000. This will allow the chatbot to respond with longer answers. Let's save this chat flow and let's test it out by clicking on chat and let's ask it a question. Something like, "What is Flowise?" And we can see that we do get a response back from the bot. Now that we have a working chatbot, let's have a look at how we can call this chatbot using the Flowise APIs. Let's click on the API endpoint button and then let's click on the JavaScript tab. If you are using other technologies like Python or any other coding language, you can just follow the examples provided in those tabs. But in this video, we will build a Node application, so let's have a look at the JavaScript example. On this screen, we can notice a few things. First, we can see the API endpoint for calling this chatbot. We can also see that the type of method is a post method, and for the headers, we have to specify the content type as application/JSON. Do take note that if your chatbot uses a document loader, the content type will look slightly different, as it will require form data to be passed to it instead. But for this demo, we will simply have a look at a simple question and answer type chatbot. For the structure of the body, we need to pass in a prop called question, followed by the actual question's text. Lastly, we can also set authorization for the endpoint. By default, authorization is set to no authorization, which means that anyone with this endpoint can call your chatbot. But in order to protect this chatbot, we can change the authorization to use the default API key, or we can add a new key. Let's have a look at protecting this chatbot using authorization. Let's close this pop-up, then let's click on back, then click on API keys. We can find the value of the default key on the screen, but we can also create new keys by clicking on Create Key. We can give our key a name. I'll call it Flowise API Tutorial, and I'll click on Add. Let's go back to our chat flows. Let's click on our chat flow. Let's go back to API Endpoint, and let's click on JavaScript again. Now, let's change the authorization from no authorization to Flowise API Tutorial. And we can now see an update to this sample code where we need to pass an authorization property to the header, which includes this bearer token. We should now be able to securely call this endpoint from our applications. To demonstrate this, let's call our endpoint from Postman. In Postman, let's create a new request. Let's change the type of request from GET to POST. As a reminder, the service expects the method to be set to POST. Let's also grab the API endpoint and let's add it to Postman. Then let's set our headers. First, we know that we need to set the authorization header, which will use a bearer token. So we can simply copy this API key. Then in Postman, let's click on the authorization tab. Let's change this from no auth to bearer token, and let's paste in that API key. Then let's click on headers. We need to set the content type to application/JSON. So for the key, let's type content type. And for the value, let's set this equal to application/JSON. Lastly, let's click on the body tag and let's click on raw. Ensure that the type is set to JSON. In the body, let's add a property called question and let's enter the prompt for this chatbot. Something like, what is Flowise? And let's send this request. And after a second, we do get this response back from our Flowise chat flow. Let's move on to the second part of this tutorial, where we will create a custom Node application with a web interface for interacting with our chat flow. To speed things up, I have already prepared a web interface for you. So in the description of this video, you will find the link to this GitHub repo. To copy this code to your machine, click on Code, then either click on Download Zip and extract the contents to your drive. But what I will do instead is to clone this repo. So I will copy this link. Then on my drive, I will run command. I will then type git clone and then paste in the link to the repo. You can then go ahead and open the folder in a code editor of your choice. I will be using VS Code. We now need to install the necessary packages. So in the terminal, execute npm install. Let's have a look at this project structure. The index.js file is the starting point for our application. And in this file, I simply created a very simple Express application. This Express application will look at the public folder for any static files, and the public folder will contain the files needed for our web application. We have also created an API endpoint for this application, which we can access by calling API/Flowise. And this endpoint will call this function, which we will have a look at in a second. The reason we are using an Express application is because we need the ability to call the Flowise chat flow from the server. Remember that when we call the chat flow, we need to pass it this bearer token, and this token needs to be a secret. This is not something that we want to make visible to the front end. So therefore, this API endpoint will run on the server only, and only this endpoint will have a view of the Flowise API key. So we are therefore detaching the back-end logic from our HTML front end. Let's now have a look at the code for this API endpoint. This create prediction function is coming from the controllers file, which we can access in the controllers directory and within Flowise. Here, I simply created a function called create prediction, and I'm exporting this function so that we can call it from the index file. This function takes in the request payload as well as the response. From the request body, we are expecting to extract a property called message. This will be the value that our front end sends to the chatbot. In this try catch block, we will now format the message into a structure which Flowise expects. If we go back to the API example, in this example we can see that Flowise expects a property called question followed by the message from the user. Therefore, I'm creating a new object with a property question followed by the message from the user. In this video, we will implement the fetch logic for calling the Flowise API endpoint, and we will add it roundabout here. Call the Flowise endpoint. Once the endpoint has been called, we will return a response with the status 200, which means successful, and this response will contain a property for message with the response from the chatbot. Currently, the response is hard-coded as well, but we will change this in this video. Let's have a look at the public folder. Within public, we can see all the files relevant for our website. This simply contains an index.html file with a very basic structure and some styling using Tailwind CSS. This is not an HTML course, so please don't worry if you do not understand all of this. But in a nutshell, the structure will give us some heading with the text Flowise API demo, followed by a form with a simple input field as well as a submit button. Then at the bottom of the page, we have a paragraph which we will use to display the chatbot's response. Within this folder, we also have a JavaScript file called app.js. At the top of this code, we are binding the HTML elements to JavaScript variables. For example, we are binding the form as well as the message input field, as well as the paragraph which stores the response from the bot and the submit button. On the form element, I've added an event listener on submit. So when the form is submitted, we will prevent the default behavior, which will prevent the page from refreshing. I'm simply logging the value from the field just for testing. I'm then setting the disabled attribute on the button to true, and I'm changing the text of the button to sending. This will simply prevent the user from clicking the button while we are calling our API endpoint. In this try block, I'm now calling this application's endpoint and then passing in the message from the user. This is not to be confused with the Flowise endpoint itself. That endpoint will be called from our controller. We are then getting the response back from our API and then writing that to the paragraph on this HTML page. Then finally, I'm setting disabled to false, changing the inner text of the button to send, and then clearing the value of the input field. We can test this application by opening up our terminal and then running npm run dev. This will now start our project on port 3000. And if I open localhost 3000, we are getting the following page. I'm actually going to put this screen next to the code editor. Right, so let's test this out. If I now enter a message like hello and then click on send, we are simply getting a response back of demo response. And that is because if we open the Flowise file, we've hard-coded this API response to demo response. Let's now call our Flowise API, and we will go through this step by step. First, let's create a variable called response, and let's call await and fetch. We now need to add the API endpoint for our Flowise application. So back in Flowise, let's grab this API endpoint and then add that to our code, like so. This value here represents the unique ID of the chat flow. If we go back to Flowise for a second, and if we look at our chat flow, we can see that ID in the address bar. This is the ID that corresponds to this specific chat flow. If you had more than one chat flow and you wanted to dynamically call these flows from your application, you could create a list of some sort in your application and then dynamically call the chat flows by changing the Chatflow ID. I'm actually going to move this value to an environment variable so that we can change it using environment variables if we wanted to. I'm going to cut this value. Then in our project files, let's open up the .env.example file. Let's rename this file like so, and let's simply call it .env. Within this file, there's a couple of variables. What we are interested in is the Flowise URL, the Flowise API key, as well as the flow ID. I'm going to paste in the flow ID into this field, but let's also add the Flowise URL and API key. For the Flowise URL, I will simply go back to my Flowise application and then copy the first part of this URL, and let's add it into this variable. Please take note to remove this trailing slash. For the Flowise API key, I will just grab that from the API endpoint sample code, and it's everything after this bearer token, like so. And let's add that to the environment variables as well. In order for the environment variables to take effect, we need to restart our dev server. So I'm just going to stop this using Control-C, and let's run the server again. You will now notice that the application is now running on port 5000 instead of 3000. So in the browser, I'll just change that from 3000 to 5000. We can now dynamically call this URL as well as the chat flow by passing in the environment variables. Let's change this to a template string by using these little backticks. Then at the end of the string, let's pass in the chat flow from the environment variables. So we'll pass in a variable, and the value will be process.env.flow ID. This needs to match the value in the .env file. Then I'm going to copy this Flowise URL value, and then let's replace this URL part of the string with the value from the environment variables, like so. The fetch function also takes in an object as input, and we will set the method to post. As a reminder, if we look at our Flowise example, Flowise expects the method to be of type post. We also need to set the headers. So I will add a property called headers, and within headers we need to set the content type to application JSON, and we also need to pass in the API key. So I will add another property called authorization. The value will be a string that starts with the word bearer followed by the API key, which we can get from process.env. And I'll just copy the value from the env file, like so. And let's add it to our code. Lastly, we need to pass in the body of this request by adding another property called body. For body, we can call json.stringify, and for the value, we will pass in Flowise data, which is this structure over here, containing the question property. This should be everything that we need to call the Flowise API. We can now extract the data from this response by creating a new variable called data, and let's call await response.json. Let's also write the value of data to the console, like so. Let's test this out. Let's go back to our application. I'm just going to refresh this. In the prompt field, let's just enter something like hello. And in the terminal, we can see the response coming back from the bot as hello, how can I assist you today? Therefore, let's simply pass back data instead of this hard-coded demo response, like so. Let's refresh this application. Let's try it again. Let's type in hello, and we are now getting the response from the bot on this screen. Let's try a few more examples. Let's do something like, what is langchain? And we do get a response back. Let's try something like, what is the difference between Flowise and langflow? And we are getting a response back from the bot. Let's have a look at deploying this custom web application to production. But before we move on, I do want to show you something that is covered in the documentation. And if we look at the documentation on the Flowise website, we can see this override config object, which we can pass into the request as well. I have been playing around with this, but at the time of recording, it seems to be a little bit unreliable. So I will create a follow-up video to go through this override config once it's stable enough. Additionally, if you are planning to upload files using document loaders, you can also see an example from the documentation on which values need to be passed to your bot. Please let me know in the comments if this is something that you would like me to cover in a future tutorial. Right, now let's have a look at deploying this custom application to render. To do this, go over to render.com and click on Dashboard. At the moment, I only have Flowise AI running on render, and we will now create a new instance for our front-end application. Let's click on New, then Web Service, and at this point, we need to select a repository for our Flowise front-end. I'm not going to cover it in this video, but you need to deploy this project to GitHub. But it's easy enough to do from VS Code by clicking on Source Code Control, then enter a name for this initial deploy, click on Commit, and that will deploy this project to GitHub. After selecting your repository, give it a name. I will call it Flowise Web App. Select your region, select the branch as master, leave the root directory blank. Under runtime, select node. For the build command, change it to npm install. Then for the start command, type node index.js. You can then select your instance type. I'll just go with the free tier. And then under advanced, we need to add a few environment variables. Let's add a new environment variable, and let's grab the Flowise URL variable, and let's add in this value as well, like so. Let's add two more environment variables for the key and the flow ID. And I will just copy the values from our env file, like so. Then we do need to add one more environment variable, and this is specific to render. Render is going to use Node version 14 as the default Node version, which is a very outdated version of Node that does not support the Fetch API. So in order to define the correct Node version, we need to add the following environment variable, Node underscore version. Then for the value, simply enter LTS. And this will ensure that the latest stable version of Node is used. We can now go ahead and deploy this web service by clicking on Create Web Service. This will take a few seconds to complete. If your environment variables were set up correctly, you will notice in the logs that we are now using Node version 18 or above and not version 14, which is the default used by render. And after deployment is complete, we can now see that the server is running. We can access our web app by clicking on this URL, and let's test this out. Hello, and I am getting a response back from our chatbot. Let's try another example. What is the difference between Langflow and Flowise? Great stuff. Of course, we are only scraping the surface of what is possible using Flowise APIs. I hope you found this video useful. Please consider subscribing to my channel and liking this video. I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.